When I think about the United States of America, I think about three things: the flag, freedom or the American dream, and our foreign policy. So, in these sessions with Flo, we're going to be talking about how our foreign policy has affected Latin American immigration. So, without further ado, here we go. It would be dishonest not to mention how U.S. foreign policy has affected Latin American immigration. And that's regardless if you are against it or for it. So this goes back to the 1820s. The Monroe Doctrine was put in place to discourage Europe from attempting to recolonize the Americas. And critics of it, however, argue that it was also an attempt for the United States to serve as the enforcer of all foreign affairs, because a lot of these countries were very vulnerable to reoccupation from Europe, more specifically Spain. So the U.S. said, we'll take care of it, you guys can stay out of it. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, how exactly did the United States do this? How did they become the enforcers of all of these countries? Well, it happened in two ways. The obvious one would be occupying the country, which happened in many of these countries. And the other one would be by supporting coups that would disrupt the status quo, that would go against the interest of the United States. So we're going to start with that one. How the United States supported coups that, again, destroyed or tried to disrupt the status quo in some of these countries. And we'll start with Mexico. In 1913, during the Mexican Revolution, the United States went against the democratically elected president, Francisco Madero. Now, he was a threat because American companies thrived under the Porfiriato. So when he came, he wanted to obviously reform many things, including land, because most of the population of Mexico had no land. And obviously, the elite in Mexico also did not support this. So the United States, again, supported those opponents of Madero. And eventually, Madero was murdered by the military and replaced by Victoriano Huerta. In Costa Rica in 1917 and then later in 1948, so Tinoco Granados and socialist Rafael Ángel Calderón. Now, Granados seized power via coup himself, but never received support from the United States. So he was forced into exile shortly after his bro was assassinated. And Calderón won support from the conservative coffee elite, but when he turned his back on them, the coffee growers obviously, did not like this, and the United States also turned his back on him and eventually had him removed. In Guatemala in 1954, they went against Jacobo Arbenz. And Arbenz was somebody who challenged the American United Fruit Company. And they happened to own the majority of the land in Guatemala. And they enjoyed many privileges, including owning about 70% of the land. And they only made up to about 2% of the population. It wasn't just them, it was more people, obviously. But clearly, land wasn't in the hands of the elite, for the most part. So his land reform policies were labeled communist, even though he wasn't a communist. And eventually, again, he was also removed. And this is during a time where, anything having to do with communism was not tolerated. Today, we see it all the time, but not back in the day, it was not. In Paraguay in 1954 as well, the overthrow of Federico Chavez, he was actually a right-winger. He wasn't a socialist. So Chavez armed the national police, and this did not sit well with the Paraguayan population and was ultimately exiled. And the U.S. aided Alfredo Stroessner. He was a former military officer, but, him being supported by the U.S. allowed him to stay in power for 44 years. So you can only imagine that. In Brazil, 1964, versus Social Democrat João Goulart. And The issue the U.S. had with him was that his tax and land reforms threatened U.S. companies. So, of course, the United States decided to aid the military coup and forced Goulart into exile. In the Dominican Republic, 1961 and 1964. So first it was against right-wing dictator Rafael Trujillo, and later on versus socialist Juan Bosch. So at first, Trujillo was beloved by the United States because his policies, protected U.S. interest. And he was also very anti-communist. However, they understood that he was just too much of an enforcer. He was too tyrannical. So eventually they just kind of give up on him, and he was murdered actually by United States weapons. However, his replacement was, like I said, a socialist. So this did not sit well with the United States. And once again, he was forced into exile after Colonel Elias Wesson took control. And in Cuba in 1961 versus the socialist Castro regime, the famous Bay of Pigs. So exiled right-wing Cubans were trained by the CIA to overthrow the Castro regime, but ended up failing. So the United States responded by putting economic sanctions on Cuba to weaken the nation. And of course, the Cuban government, because of this, became more authoritarian. And you can argue that, this was good or bad, depending on what side you're on. But the point is that Cuba suffered from this because of the sanctions. In Bolivia in 1971 versus Juan José Torres, again another socialist, he focused on workers' rights, academics, and peasants, of course, and a strong socialist military. This made him unpopular with the United States, obviously, and he only served 1 year as president of Bolivia. He was exiled, but eventually he was murdered under the Operation Condor. Chile in 1973, again versus a socialist, Salvador Allende. He was also democratically elected by the Chilean people, and he sought to nationalize major industries, expand education, and improve the living standards of the working class. However, he was assassinated by Augusto Pinochet after Allende supposedly committed suicide, according to the reports, but they believe that he was, he was assassinated. He was a replacement, Augusto Pinochet. In Argentina, 1976, versus elected president Isabel Perón. She was actually the first female president, and she enacted worker-friendly laws, but she was not a leftist. However, there was just too much political instability in Argentina during her regime, and the U.S. just did not support her, so whoever took over, they essentially supported them. Of course, El Salvador in 1979 versus the left-wing organization FMLN. So this organization was a militant leftist organization that aimed at dismantling the elite privileges, which also, again, threatened U.S. forces. And the U.S. aided the right-wing government that committed countless political horrible acts against political opponents. And this obviously contributed to the decade-long civil war in El Salvador. And then in Nicaragua from 1979 to 1990, again versus socialist Sandinistas. So disgruntled Nicaraguans revolted against the brutal dictatorship of the Somoza family, which took power in 1912. And they overthrew them, and they established a socialist state. Their aims were to, develop the economy because it was pretty much a feudal economy under the Somoza regime. However, again, the United States did not approve this, and they actually responded by funding the right-wing Contras. And this was justified because, according to anti-communist individuals in Nicaragua, the Sandinista regime began to violate human rights against opponents. Could be true, could be false, who knows. Anywho, the United States ended up funding the Contras, and they were there for a while. They were there for a long time. Venezuela, from 1999 to now, actually, versus socialist Hugo Chavez and the current president today, obviously, of course. So when Chavez took power and he aimed at achieving economic independence, equitable distribution of revenues, and of course to end political corruption. However, it was his anti-U.S. rhetoric and nationalization of oil which made him enemies with the United States. So of course the U.S. responded with economic sanctions, which ultimately crippled the Venezuelan economy to this day. Okay, so that was the coups, right? So now occupation, when the United States actually physically occupied these nations. First one was Mexico from 1846 to 1848, which resulted in the Mexican Cession. So prior to that, the U.S. actually attempted to purchase northern Mexico before this war even took place. But Mexico would always refuse. So then the next best thing was the Texas Revolution, which created friction between Anglos and Mexicans. So again, if you know anything about the Texas Revolution, Anglos were actually welcomed to Texas, but they did not follow Mexican law, which resulted in a war, and then eventually Texas becoming its own country. However, the territory was disputed, so this would result in a war between the United States and Mexico, and ultimately the U.S. occupying major cities in the country, including Mexico City. So the United States actually occupied a lot of major cities and had its eyes on the entire country. Many people don't know that. They were gonna actually control the entire country. Reason why they did not do that was because most of the population was peasants and they were non-English speakers. So they only took the sparsely populated areas that are now the U.S. Southwest. So in return, the U.S. Mexico surrenders, and the U.S. pays $15 million for the northern territory of what is now the U.S. Southwest. In Cuba, from 1898 to 1906, and because of the Spanish-American War, this happened because the United States claims that Spain blew up the USS Maine, which happened to blow up near Havana. And the U.S. supported Cuban independence because the Cubans wanted independence from Spain. However, they took over the nation. And under the Platt Amendment, and this amendment basically allowed the United States to stay in Cuba and forced them to sign. And it almost became like a colony, an extension of the United States. And they were like this up until the 1959 Cuban Revolution. Puerto Rico from 1898 to today, again, also because of the Spanish-American War, same thing, they wanted independence, but, today they are in this battle of statehood or territory. Surprisingly, not most people want independence. I mean, I'm sure there is some, but according to stats and polls, there is not enough people who want complete independence from the United States. And then the Banana Wars that had to do with Nicaragua, Panama, Honduras, Haiti, and also the Dominican Republic from 1898 to 1934. This is a long occupation, obviously. So the U.S. sent Marines to occupy these countries to ensure that U.S. interests, again, were protected. More specifically, the tropical trade, hence the term Banana Wars. So under these, governments that were supported by the United States, terrible things happened, right? So most of them tended to be right-wing, obviously. Even if they weren't, they still practiced some pretty terrible things. One of them was they banned political parties. So whoever took power said, this is the only party we're going to have, no more parties, et cetera, et cetera. And they arrested people who were, opponents of these political parties. They dissolved Congress and scrapped the Constitution in many of these places. Again, these countries that were trying to be independent from the U.S. support, a lot of the times, face terrible consequences. So the new governments that took place would say, whatever this other organization or a regime was wanting to complete, not going to happen. And during, again, these regimes in Latin America that were supported by the U.S., they would torture and repress people. This was very common. Rape, horrible things would happen, right? Kidnapping. There was a case that I was reading where women who were continuously raped in jails, gave birth to kids. And when those kids were born, they were actually given to other people. So you can imagine that. Horrible things. Of course, mass executions and hundreds of thousands of people. And those people who, again, went against the government and more specifically against U.S.-backed regimes. Okay, so now we go back to immigration. How did all this affect immigration? I mean, it's pretty obvious, I would say, right? But just to put things into perspective, Latinos made up 1 million people of the U.S. population in 1960. So, pretty small. By 2010, they were 19 million. So during 1960 and 2010, a lot of things happened, obviously, right? So every U.S.-backed coup had an impact on immigration. For example, the Mexican Revolution, you saw about 200,000 immigrants coming into the United States. And during the Cuban Revolution, you saw about 400,000 immigrants come into the United States. And then from the Nicaraguan Revolution, you saw about 7,500. And lastly, the Salvadoran Civil War brought about 200,000 people. So today, this, controversy of immigration, you hear people on the left, on the right, even Latinos who are on both sides, who are either for immigration, fully open borders. And there's also individuals who don't want that, right? Who want some kind of immigration policies that are fair, or some folks just don't want it at all, right? Regardless of how you feel on the issue, you have to recognize this, right? So it would be ignorant on your part not to see this. So as somebody who's always been pretty critical of government overreach myself as a libertarian, our foreign policy, not just with Latin America, but really with most countries all over the world, has affected us in many, many ways. I mean, you can talk about what's happening now in current times, right? With China and just all these things that are very controversial. It doesn't matter. Our foreign policy, is something that a lot of us don't really pay attention to. We pay attention to the politics that happen at home, the things that happen here in the United States. And we battle between Democrats and Republicans, right? But ultimately, our foreign policy affects all of us here in the U.S. And I think if we paid more attention to that and realized that it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican, these individuals in history have done this, right? So the difference is that, the Democrats will hide under progressiveness or will say, well, we're doing this for these people, right? But at the end of the day, they're still committing terrible things. And Republicans are just, very nonchalant, don't really care if you like them or not. They are going to go about it their way. But on that note, this concludes today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned a lot of things today. Again, all the sources are in the channel. If you look at the description, you'll see every single source. If you're not following me on Instagram, if you're not following me on TikTok, go ahead and do that. Twitter as well. So again, on that note, this is Flo. To the next one. Peace.
Who said that we would leave? Who said that we would leave? 725, it's a flown little scene. Who said that we would leave? Who said that we would leave? 725, it's a flown little scene. Who said that we would leave? Who said that we would leave? 725, it's a flown little scene. Who said that we would leave? Who said that we would leave? 725, it's a flown little scene. At age 15, it started as a dream. Became so addicted, had to have it like a fiend. Write my thoughts on paper for the shit I seen. Throw on a pair of dickies, but don't make it what it seems. Result in my environment, brought up in this wickedness. I woke the sleeping tiger and expressing my distress. So tell me what is next, but to leave you all perplexed. For the feelings I expressed, never had fucking regrets. 20 years ago, a primo went to bros. Had a mission to make dough, making our talent grow. Through the ups and the downs, but never out of bounds. Making money is what counts, always searching like some hounds. Now the dream is a reality, check out the vitality. Sick like a brutality, all the tonality speaks on its own. Shining brighter than some chrome, now we rising like some bomb. And we do it alone. Who said that we would leave? Who said that we would leave? 725, it's a flown little C. Who said that we would leave? Who said that we would leave? 725 is a flown little C. Who said that we would leave? Who said that we would leave? 725 is a flown little C. Who said that we would leave? Who said that we would leave?